Good morning everyone, and welcome to Room 451, Law in a Transformative Age, our last executive webinar with a 45-minute format. The topic of today is blockchain and artificial intelligence, Europe as a platform. Our guest is Andrea Renda, a well-known scholar, professor of digital innovation at Collège d'Europe, head of global governance, innovation and regulation at CEPS, the leading think tank of European affairs, advisor and expert of the European Commission on digital innovation, artificial intelligence, blockchain, and so on. So thanks, Andrea, for coming.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Andrea is one of the leaders of an initially restricted scientific community at the few events, which has pushed the European and national institutions for support to digitalization and for acquiring a guide of the technological revolution. I refer to the leading role that European companies have long had, for example, with GSM technology, and then with its evolution, UMTS, which today have lost for the benefit of Chinese companies as regards terminals and network infrastructures, and US multinationals in the cloud. In this partition of the world market, Europe and European companies has remained excluded. We have not resigned ourselves to taking note of this situation. We have written books and articles and suggested paths and procedures. In a book of last year, The Power of the Algorithm, I highlighted the loss of digital sovereignty, national and European, and I called for a public commitment for digital infrastructure, not only for the transport network, also fundamental, of course, but for the infrastructure that develops on it, which holds true wealth, data management. A national infrastructure that would create value and at the same time let European data stay in the territory of the European Union with all the protection that EU law provides. An infrastructure that, in perspective, should also guarantee permission blockchains and within them the most advanced applications from payments to smart contracts. Andrea has written many books in recent months, one in particular in which he highlighted hidden treasures, where the European Union has a competitive advantage that deserves to be exploited and from which it can start again. In recent days, he wrote a paper in which he pushed the accelerator further. Now, as you know, visionaries are generally outsiders. Andrea, conversely, has always managed to remain so despite being mainstream. As a matter of fact, in recent months, in a way that only to superficial observers has seemed surprising, the new geopolitical European Commission has shown a path that not only follows many of these proposals that until recently seemed visionary, or in any case the market considered to be such, but it even went further. With a look that once belonged to industrial policy and today I renamed European policy of necessary solidarity growth. The path deserves to be explained. Then we move to strategies. So Andrea, in your last paper, Single Market 2.0, the European Union as a platform, you wrote that the new European Commission made a strong commitment to the digital transition, positioning the digital environment as a critical infrastructure and postulating the need for digital sovereignty and the twin transition, green and digital, as cornerstones of its new geopolitical mission. Through a comprehensive, ambitious data strategy and the white paper on artificial intelligence that we all know you helped write, the Commission may anticipate future market developments by achieving a first-mover advantage in the second wave of digital transformation. Am I right, Andrea?
Fabio, you're always right. So that would be redundant. So thanks for having me, and it's a pleasure to be having this conversation with you. I've been following your scholarship and also in particular the book on the power of the algorithm on which we had conversations in the past. And I found it to be also very much in line with my own thinking. So It's good that these parallel paths can converge today into this conversation. It is a very strange moment, a very, very interesting moment after two decades of evolution of the internet, of rather linear, if you wish, evolution of the digital economy. We are at the juncture, at the moment of discontinuity, if you wish. And there are a number of things that have emerged that create both opportunities and challenges for the European Union in particular. And I try to outline them as briefly as possible. The first is the rise of the data-driven economy, which largely in the first generation of the first 3 decades of internet has seen an explosion of data largely generated by end users. It is largely the business to consumer and the government to consumer angle that has developed. And it's also developed in a way that is largely unregulated since the early decisions when the internet came, to permeate our lives in the early to mid 90s, was to let this permissionless innovation flow. Now, what is happening there is a first development, which largely is made of data and is made of large brains that make the most of this data. And it's largely made of centripetal forces that bring those brains into a very limited number of places. So we have now the tech giants, the digital platforms, that having conquered an important share of the user attention, monetize this attention in various ways. And this also means that since they need counterparties, both upstream and downstream, in various other meanders of the digital economy, with all of these counterparties, they will have a structural bargaining superiority or superior bargaining power. There is a full economy that is, to use a term that we Italians know very well, is in a situation of economic dependency, if you wish, on the large tech giants. Now, this has been a first development that has largely also been a development that was based on an important condition, that these economies, these network effects in particular in the digital economy, are powerful forces that require that for every generation, one player wins and the others lose. The winner-take-all competition is an important ingredient of all this, because it has created the first challenges for the European Union. In Europe, we have a culture of competition which is much more focused on fragmented market structures, let's say more pluralistic market structures, compared to the Chicago school antitrust in the United States. We come from the ordoliberal school, if you wish, that really was very much in favor of preserving a structure made of small and medium-sized enterprises. So a wave of innovation that comes with big tech giants that then have those galaxies around them is not something that a European lawyer or a European policymaker could digest very easily. And after all, if we look at this with hindsight, after so many years, we could also say that it maybe hasn't brought about a perfect situation even in the US or in China. We have now the trillion-dollar companies. We have now the data largely preserved in the hands of the trillion-dollar companies. We have very important polarization in the market with a rise of market power almost everywhere around the world. We have the problem of the superstar firms, if you wish, and the problem of the very oversized tech giants or superstar firms. Sometimes they're called in the literature. And we also have a labor market that is completely polarized. And we have a situation that, as we saw post or during the COVID-19 crisis, is a situation that I wouldn't describe as sustainable. And also I wouldn't describe as necessarily aligned with what are the key European values, such as, for example, the protection of fundamental rights. So that is the first big wave. There is an increasingly unsustainable polarization in the market, and this is also evolved into a G2 competition where the United States and China are competing on turfs that are not necessarily coinciding with the interests that Europe has, for example, on sustainable development. So there is an opportunity in exercising leadership on something else that's simply a digital Cold War, for example, in uses of artificial intelligence for good or artificial intelligence for the Green Deal, as we would call it at European level. That is one thing. The other thing is technology. The second development is very important because this first wave that I've described, the big data explosion from the users, is now going to be superseded and surpassed by another wave, which is the data produced by the things. And as the data are produced by the things, and there's going to be a lot more data produced by the things, the brain that we have created in this first wave will start needing bones, muscles, a nervous system. And this is what we call the IoT age, the edge layers, the IoT age. This brain will also needs to take decisions much closer to the things. Think about a self-driving car. A self-driving car, whenever it needs to decide on a specific situation, cannot just ship the information onto the cloud, get it back, and then decide, because latency would be potentially disastrous in this respect. So we need to bring, for this and many other decisions that need to be taken remotely, this requires that we now develop brains that are as close as possible to the things. We call it edge layer or embedded AI in many cases. And we need to couple this with things, sensors, actuators. Now, in this new scenario, the European Commission has identified an opportunity, and also based on conversations and advice that many experts have given to the Commission, and in particular Commissioner Thierry Breton. The idea is that this data storage and brain capacity, computing capacity at the more distributed level, is very different from having the data and the brains in the cloud. And when you look at the edge and the device layers, maybe the Americans and the Chinese are not necessarily already dominating that part. So rather than saying, oh my goodness, we missed the train of the data economy, rather than saying we will never have a European Facebook, we should build one, rather than saying we are now a digital colony of the United States and China, we could actually start saying, well, we don't want to take giants. We want to have very solid companies. We want to have distributed and decentralized architectures where players can develop solutions in a federated way. And we can try and conquer, through digital sovereignty and through industrial competitiveness, those areas, those more remote, more decentralized area, closer to the things, such as the edge cloud architectures that are not currently dominated by anyone. And here's where Thierry Breton starts saying, here's our opportunity. We think that in 5 years from now, while today 80% of the data are in the cloud, 20% of the data are at the edge, in 5 years, there will be 20% in the cloud, 80% on the edge. Well, we need to go there. It's a good exercise. It's maybe also a hope, because this is where the opportunity is. But it's also a way to say, this is where we have to put our money, our wishes, our ambition, our political commitment, because there is a chance for Europe to remain a leading player if we invest in those things where we have a traditional leadership. So manufacturing, IoT, healthcare, education, and most importantly, government. Well, here's the opportunity. Now, how do we reap this opportunity? This requires a level of political commitment that would be almost acrobatic, almost Herculean. But I think we haven't missed the train yet. We haven't lost the game yet. And so I would say it's time to work together towards this direction.
Yeah, let's talk about strategies, because you are saying that first move is rebalancing competition and value allocation in B2C domain. This is what you wrote in your last paper. From competition policy to federated cloud infrastructure. Just for sum it up your thinking. The cloud as managed today, made by North American multinationals in a centralized way, has a decentralized future. It is a proximity cloud, self-driving vehicles, home automation, as you were saying. But decentralization requires a federated infrastructure. So from this assumption, I think some considerations start. The first one is what you were saying, is that as the spread of data grows at an exponential and decentralized level, the game is not only not lost, but has yet to begin. So there is room for planning strategies. The second is that we must use the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality for a federated European infrastructure, which can only be achieved if local infrastructures are interoperable with each other. And the third is that this perspective entails a change of European policies, starting with that of competition and regulation. As for competition, I think that this move towards decentralization may overcome the super dominant position enjoyed by digital platforms that are now gatekeepers of the internet and concentrate all the value generated by digital economy. As for regulation, this evolution can foster the bottom-up model that I called regulatory circle. Regulatory circle works that way. Regulation arises from the market, which creates best practices that national regulatory authorities transform into benchmarks and propose to the network of European authorities, who submit them to the European Commission. And the European Commission transfers them into executive acts or in legislative proposals which Parliament, Council then approve. So, in other words, regulation is already decentralized. Do you agree on these considerations?
Yeah, the source of regulation is, I think, a mixture, in my opinion, of a bottom-up and top-down developments. In most cases, that is a typical case of the digital economy. Private governance and private regulation has, by and large, dominated the internet for the first decades of its life. Again, the choice not to regulate the internet has come with real choices and what we call semi-open architectures, in which the real regulators of the internet were, for example, Microsoft in setting the APIs for Windows. This is a form that it would be called transnational private regulation in the literature, more broadly beyond the digital economy sphere. Indeed, if you take, for example, some of the landmark publications on private governance and private regulation, I'll say Bute and Matley, 2011, they call among the new global rulers, they put Microsoft with Windows. It has been the private players, let alone their own organizations with ICANN or IETF or the World Wide Web Consortium. All these are private organizations, right, where the rules are set by the private players, the engineers, and so on and so forth. So the regulation has been private since the very beginning. And mostly this has been about code. It is about how do you determine the boundaries of what's possible by designing your products in a way that makes certain things possible and others impossible. And this is something that we've already seen in the evolution of the internet. The original open-ended, neutral, end-to-end internet is something that makes almost everything possible, although it already constrains through its protocols some of the things that you can and cannot do. The more you go into so-called walled gardens or semi-open architectures, the platformization of the internet, as we call it, the more the constraints increase and the more the internet becomes non-neutral and very much steered and nudged by a number of players. Now, that was to some extent inevitable, but what I was trying to explain before is that we tend to study today the internet a little bit like we study biology, right? Depending on what is possible, what the architecture and the conditions make possible, the evolution of the internet will be heavily affected by that, and thereby maybe the idea of having fully decentralized architectures was not altogether possible until a few years ago. Today, it is still largely theoretically possible in having fully permissionless, fully scalable blockchains, for example. Tomorrow, with technological advances, it might become possible, and we need to study these trends in this respect. Now, what does this mean for public policy? Now, for competition policy, we see a clear turning point, right? The European Commission is determined to modernize competition law. The German debate on the Digitalization Act already brings into the picture things like intermediation power as opposed to a dominant position, or special rules for players that are in a particular paramount, not necessarily dominant only, but paramount position or prominent position in the overall internet environment. These are ad hoc rules to capture a phenomenon that is new. Because indeed, I will cut this short because otherwise it's a much longer issue, but indeed, platforms are a hybrid form of governance that doesn't resemble the traditional firm and doesn't resemble the market forces themselves. So the rules that have been traditionally conceived for what we call undertaking in antitrust, the platform is not the traditional undertaking. A platform is something that shrinks to the extent possible the dimension, the size of the firm by outsourcing everything, even the mutual control between supply and demand, even our rating of Uber drivers, for example, and at the same time maximizes the profit that comes from moving all these economies. So you have Uber, for example, that has 20,000 employees and 4 million drivers, and you have, not in this occasion, but in most other occasions, you have companies like Zoom that have a capitalization that is greater than US airlines, that is also actually going down in terms of capitalization, but with 2,500 employees. So the rules conceived for players that can move mountains with only one finger in terms of size and assets are not the same rules that we used to have for the Rockefeller times antitrust, or even the early days Microsoft antitrust. So we need to make sure that this is reflected, and I think the European Commission is going in this way. This is reflected in the regulatory part as well. We have very interesting examples, although difficult to judge at this stage, but certainly very interesting experiments, such as PSD2 at the EU level, meaning what we used to do in terms of granting access to what we thought was an essential facility at the time of the network industries now goes up one layer and becomes, in a rather acrobatic way, in a very difficult way in terms of implementation, but an attempt to grant access to what is considered to be the actual essential facility today, which is the availability of data. Sometimes with unintended consequences. So this will have to be fixed, most likely over time. But this is what is happening from a regulatory perspective. There's no way the EU can continue to exercise its regulatory power acclaimed at the global level without incorporating its principles and its rules into software code. And that is something that we are trying to do, and that the European Commission is trying to do with the so-called future federated cloud infrastructure. Gaia X already, the Franco-German initiative, incorporates compliance with specific European rules in the protocols, but also with the design, with the now blossoming design of the data spaces coming from the data strategy presented on the 19th of February this year by Thierry Breton, where the data spaces actually become a place where you can forget about open data, you can forget about data flowing freely into the infosphere, and actually the data are carefully managed and shared in a way that preserves control as close as possible to where value is originally generated.
Yeah, you're talking about private regulation. I totally agree. In my vision, we get two communicating vessels: the private regulation and public regulation. The new European regulation is general in principle. Application details are entrusted to the care of national regulatory authorities. The empty spaces to be filled are more and more. A means of filling the gaps, I believe, could be that of private regulation. It is a complementary tool to public regulation, which applies where it stops. And I speak, of course, of regulation through contracts. The codification of a uniform law, which elaborates model contracts applied in different countries and different jurisdictions, is a tool that seems to be in disuse, and instead could be useful again, above all, to insert in these contractual models those European principles and values that we could not only safeguard but export. It would be a way of exporting values and principles without resorting to the extraterritorial rules, which, for example, many critical issues are creating for the application of the European data protection regulation abroad. Mm-hmm. Don't you agree?
I do agree. I think it's a very complicated field, and I think the people like you, Fabio, should be as close as possible to the policymakers, because my impression is that whenever the rules are crafted at EU level, national level, the complementary power of private regulation and the regulation of inter-private transactions, if you wish, is almost never taken into account. The fact that the market forces and the individual behavior come to complement the rules that are shaped at the public level is something that shapes enormously the ultimate impact of the rules. And it's very often neglected, in particular in Brussels, because the European Commission is still very far away from the moment in which those rules will really land on their implementation phase. But that said, I think I wanted to note one specific passage in what you said. We are now moving from a scenario, a previous situation in which the agenda setting, the normative activity, and the implementation was largely in the hands of private companies, platforms, not companies actually. We are moving into a situation in which the public sector is reappropriating agenda setting. And also in the setting of rules, there is a little bit more interplay between public and private. To give you one example, I am now putting in the finishing touches on the updated version of the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI and at the EU level as a member of the high-level expert group. And on Monday, we will publish the guidelines and a set of sectoral takeaways or suggestions for future public policy. The idea of creating sort of principles-based regulation and operationalizing that also through providing a set of actions that could become a blueprint for future private sector activities is a new way of shaping regulation, if you wish. It's a way to give directionality to what otherwise has been so far largely the product of market forces. And it's a way in which the public sector tries to remedy some of the distortions that have been brought about by this very, very important phenomenon, which is the internet and the digital economy. So what does this mean in the future in terms of shifting sands in between the public and the private sector? I think that the complementarity between the two has to be exploited a lot more. And model contracts could be absolutely essential because they will have a very important nudging power and a sort of a boilerplate power, as we would call it in other parts of law, for the activity of the private sector. It's a good example. A good example is this activity on creating an assessment list for trustworthy AI, where we see from IBM, so American companies, but also many European companies already developing their own version of our assessment list. We are publishing this as an open source software so that every company can sort of customize it. But that, by creating a default option, also behaviorally, has a very important impact on the market. And you can, depending on the sector, we will have to learn over time. And I'm sorry about this, Fabio, because both you and I, we studied a long time ago. We never stopped studying, and we have to continue studying things because we have to develop these new muscles in the future. The policymaker has to understand how to chip into the breathtaking development of private solutions in a way that gives direction every now and then, like when you're sailing or like when you are really trying to govern some form of phenomenon. That is something that has happened in the past. We come from a generation of great embarrassment and impasse. We have demonized the platforms, and at the same time, we were asking them to take down content algorithmically. So we recognize that we don't want necessarily that model, but at the same time, we also recognize that we cannot do without that model. And so we have to come to a solution that where in the policy cycle, from the setting of the agenda to the shaping of the rules up to the implementation phase and the monitoring and evaluation of all this, we policymakers and we academics find a much better way of using technology and acting at the interplay, at the interface between law and technology.
You said that we are in the strategy, the current strategy, the Commission is to overcome the open data, the Juncker Commission open data strategy. You said that this strategy is over. Do you think that the open data gonna be replaced by a closed architecture, federated closed architecture? What is the relationship between this new approach and GDPR? Because when Zuckerberg invokes the application of data protection, or Apple and Google impose a decentralized model of exposure notification, we should start asking questions.
Yeah. My favorite way of describing this would be, rather than from an open data season to closed data or closed architectures, from open data to managed data and shared data. and to some extent also control diffusion of the data, in particular when it comes to the personal data, but also when it comes to industrial data, which require, of course, a limited or a controlled circulation to avoid appropriation of intellectual property or even tacit knowledge and know-how. So the issue there is, open data sounds almost impossible to criticize, right? It's like when we were talking about net neutrality. I mean, these are these terms that evoke a positive meaning in any case. So I was an advisor to Commissioner Moedas in the past commission, on the Commissioner for Research, and he came out with this slogan, open science, open innovation, open to the world, which is very ecumenical. But then he also realized that an open world is a world in which openness is like when you say, water is potentially overabundant in the world, but it can be locally scarce. And the same is with data. I mean, you can have data freely flowing, but there's only a few players that can have the sheer size of data storage that allows them to be almost impossible to attack in their market position. And this openness is not a value in and of itself, although it has proven to be a value for many architectures and business models. But the open data without control has proven to be something that generates monsters. And it certainly generates monsters for the European Commission if the European Union wants to develop architectures and data spaces in which the players that will then gravitate around maybe a platform needs to be remunerated and needs to be nurtured just as much as the platform, because the open data will just create a centripetal force and will lead the value to accrue all in the hands of certain players. Now, you can do without, you can have open data, but then even push further the openness of data and impose mandatory interoperability requirements, which will mean that now personal data not only flow in the hands of people that are beyond our control and platforms that do things with them that we cannot control, but this can also later be shared in a second round of large secondary market. So how do we create a world like that, which is intuitively would be fascinating, right? In which we have competition between companies that all share the same information set. I think that is, as things stand technologically, very difficult. It is much easier for a policymaker today to sort of avoid full openness and redistribute entitlement over data to the end users and to the real economy players, to then put them in a better situation vis-a-vis the platforms that will want to develop on top of this data. We've seen already examples of this. We've seen GDPR to some extent with its principle, still not translated into code, if you wish, that is of the user control over data and data minimization. We have the IHAN protocol that is proposed by the Finnish Innovation Authority, Sitra, as a way to realize sort of a user control over data, the My Data movement, the solid movement that Tim Berners-Lee is developing. There are a number of initiatives like this that try to restore user control over data. There is a code of conduct that gives the entitlement over data to farmers in agriculture. There is the industrial data spaces literature and practice in Fraunhofer and more generally in Germany that tries to give the data back in the hands, or entitlements over data in the hands of for example, the automotive companies or the heavy industry companies, and so on and so forth. And this leads me to the last bit of this comment, which is the reason why we cannot fully imagine a world made of fully decentralized architecture where everybody has the same information set, which is the promise of blockchain as of today, is not only a technological one, but it's still we haven't figured out how to reconcile a world in which we have this absolute redundancy, like everybody is a synchronized version of the information set that others have. So it's not only technically impossible, but also meets with very important constraints in respect to the need to control the circulation of data, and in particular the need to guarantee the erasure of the data and also guarantee more generally the right to data protection and privacy of the individual end users. So the next years we'll also see that at the front of research, which is how do we reconcile what technology increasingly makes possible, trust enhancing rather than trustless. And I saw that was a comment in the chat on this, that's why I'm going there. Increasingly trust enhancing architectures where the transaction costs are reduced by the sharing of similar information sets. So largely permissioned blockchains today, as we see increasingly in supply chains, for supply chain management or e-identity, for example. How do we reconcile this with a strong legal apparatus that protects the rights and the fundamental rights, in particular, of the end users? And this is the reason why you should have at least 2 or 3 other series like this, Room 451, Fabio, because I think we're not there yet. We might be talking about this much more intensely, maybe in 3 years.
Thank you, Andrea. We'll see. I think that interoperability is a magic word in the telecommunications world, but even regulation. Let's put it that way. I have been writing for years that regulatory silos must be overcome. Vertical silos no longer make sense because with the digital revolution, operators can offer services in all fields. Banking, insurance, financial, energy, postal services, and so on. So from regulation by subjects, we have moved on to regulation by activity. And it is now necessary to move on to regulation by product. The consequence, I believe, is that it is necessary to regulate in a general and cross-sectoral way on principles. Last week, the president of the Italian Authority for Financial Markets, Paolo Savona, argued for the need for more uniform regulation of the banking, financial, and insurance market. And this is also because of the technological revolution. Is that a way of no return, your way?
Well, certainly the technological revolution has led to a big blurring of the boundaries between the silos, the previous silos, like the individual sectors. That is a little bit the contradiction of the current European Commission, if you wish, because to some extent there is a move towards, if you wish, mission-oriented policy, in particular for the Sustainable Development Goals, the Green Deal, needs-based policy. For many years, in particular the last 5 years, we have stopped calling transportation, we now call it mobility. We don't call housing, we call it shelter. And so we try to abstract from the individual definition of the industry to go into the achievement of the outcome. And overall, this has led to a tendency for regulation to become at once more principles-based and more outcome-based. And everything that is in the middle becomes the realm of, if you wish, private governance, but also flexible, adaptive regulation, as we call it in the literature. But then you have the European Commission that says, here's the data spaces, which are very much siloed, apparently. And in the industrial policy strategy presented on the 10th of March, they'd even talk about ecosystems. So I think, I don't know if it's public yet, in a couple of days on Les Echos, it's an economic newspaper, with Donald Kauf, my co-author in Hidden Treasures, we publish a piece on the aviation industry, right? And because there's talks about the bailout of the airlines today, also big agreement with Lufthansa. And the issue is, when you see these bailout attempts in industrial policy, the temptation is to say, well, then aviation is the ecosystem. And indeed, this is in contradiction with everything else that we've been doing so far, because in principle, mobility should be the ecosystem, and the place that aviation will have. Fabio and I were exchanging some views ahead of this call about whether we will have the same propensity to travel, to fly, even for a short meeting in the future or for a short conference talk, meaning maybe the sustainability requirements, which is our endpoint, will require that in the mobility ecosystem, aviation plays a smaller role or has a smaller share. But if you are post-lockdown and post-COVID, then you need to say something to the workers that are losing their jobs in the airlines, you are much more tempted to use aviation as an ecosystem. So that type of contradiction is not resolved currently and requires some policy work at the EU level. Other than this, I think in the future we will see the need to create, to depart from the industry-specific or domain-specific or sector-specific regulatory requirements. Most of this will be done through softer adaptations. It could be through standards. It could be through even something more agile than industry standards. And what will happen, in my opinion, is that we will converge much more towards principles-based and outcome-based regulation. I'm working specifically, for example, on the reorientation of the better regulation agenda at EU level, which is the ex-ante impact assessments, the ex-post evaluations of all legislation. So the criteria that let us say, this goes, this doesn't go. I mean, this is a good thing, a good policy action, and this is not a good one. From a more traditional, if you wish, cost-benefit analysis scenario, where you look for the net benefits, very much mainstream, yes, but also what we would call neoclassical economics style, into a situation in which we decide whether a directive or a regulation at EU level should be pursued or not, or a specific option, a specific design should be pursued or not on the basis of the net benefits, but on the basis of to what extent we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, which is the quintessential outcome-based regulation. The same transition we've seen at the global level. In principle, the OECD Development Center last year released a report when it was observing how difficult it is currently to move from the Washington Consensus, which is very much about ease of doing business, doing less, doing more with less, reducing red tape, very, very traditional concept, into what is called a goal-based paradigm, which is the Sustainable Development Goals, setting the multidimensional vision of the society we want to live in a few years from now, and then using policy to get there, rather than treating, for example, industry sectors as a means in and of themselves. And here's my footnote. When I started my work that is about to finish now in 3 days as a member of the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence at the Commission, it's a mandate, it's a 2-year mandate, expires now on the 29th of June on our last meeting. The European Commission came to us, 52 people, and told us, we would like you to give us some advice on the ethics of AI. We would like you to give us some advice on how to boost, it's a typical term used in the policy jargon, to boost European competitiveness in AI. And I immediately raised my hand and said, I actually disagree with this, because I don't want to ask myself, what can Europe do for AI? I'd rather ask myself the other question, which is, what can AI do for Europe, and how can AI help us achieve the Sustainable Development Goals? This is indeed the same approach that we've adopted. I was part of the task force on AI of the MISE, the Minister for Economic Development in Italy. The Italian strategy that is about to be finally published takes this approach, AI for something, AI for good, as opposed to the other way around. And I think that is the way in which Europe can also become a leader, because as United States and China fight on often more trivial uses of artificial intelligence, the European Union might have the chance of specializing itself in using technology for something, so in using technology as a means rather than an end.
We're going back to values, to basic values, maybe. Yeah. With the final outcome. Thank you, Andrea, for participating in our latest Room 451 executive webinar, and for giving us such a valuable interpretation of the evolution of European regulation, which we know is shared by many in Brussels. Thanks to all those who followed us in these 7 executive webinars, which were certainly challenging. But how they have allowed technical and not political debate on critical issues, decisive for our new future. They have certainly been useful to me because I learned a lot. Still can't say if Room 451 will resume in the fall, or if it will become something else. It was a great challenge, useful, even if a crazy research experiment. So thank you all. Thanks, Andrea, again.
Thank you, Fabio. Thanks, everybody.